Very good. Thank you all for coming to the Mid-Coast Council of Governments Housing Forum. This is our first step. We did some initial housing work back during the pandemic, but we're really doing some work now in terms of capturing people's ideas and information, presenting ideas and information to you about what's going on a state level, what's going on a county level, and helping you understand the different issues and strategies that are coming forward with housing. And I think what we learned in a session earlier today is that it's not just affordable housing, it's all housing markets and the broad spectrum of housing that we in the Mid-Coast are struggling with and working to address. I'm going to cover a slide real quickly that as soon as Max gets back, we'll end up launching that. That will talk a little bit about my impressions having been going around the region from Brunswick up to Camden and by the way, now adding the southern part of Waldo to our region through a state grant, and talking to various people about affordable housing, about market rate housing, about the needs for delivering housing on a bunch of different levels. And I'm going to share those impressions with you. Then we'll move to Dan Brennan from Maine State Housing Authority, who will walk you through the programs that he has available. And then our two speakers who have informed us that they are close to arriving, having caught the usual Route 1 traffic. We'll be getting here at about 20 of, and then Greg Payne will talk a little bit about the governor's strategies from the Governor's Office of Innovation and Futures. And then Jeff Levine will present to you and offer some ideas on the new statute LD 2003, which allows for accessory uses as a matter of right, and also increases some potential densities of housing beyond what your traditional zoning ordinance is locally. So thank you, Max. We will begin to go through that slide presentation now, and then move on to our other presenters. So here are some of my presentations. What I want to share with you in my second slide, though, is that's okay. What I want to share with you with my second slide is an article that Deb Keller sent to me today, which I think is an absolutely wonderful discussion of housing and housing development issues, and how we, in the context that we have been addressing housing, can move forward. And I think it's fascinating because she talks about housing being an issue across all markets, and that if we begin to address all markets, we may be able to create the supply that we need to serve up and down the housing continuum. And next slide, Max, if I can talk a little bit about housing continuum, just so we've got a ground basing discussion. You know, along the continuum, we have homelessness in shelters, and then in transitional housing. There's some earlier discussion about whether shelters are the right term or not, but that is the term that's been used in a number of areas. And then the renter market, market rate, subsidized rental markets, and Dan will touch on that. Supportive housing, which is a specialized rental market. And then age restricted, which is another market area that the Housing Authority addresses. And then home buyers and homeowners. I generally break this down into two categories now: the first time home buyer and the next home buyer. And I like to point out the next home buyer because as they step down or step up, they create supply as well. And so we want to be sure that we're providing supply for all of those. So, you know, in this slide, we've got some issues associated with homelessness. This is information that was collected at the pit count in January of 2022. That is a coordinated one-day count that attempts to identify homelessness, the reasons for homelessness, and the numbers of homeless that were in the state. This is from Maine Housing Authority's report, and it should. What was that?
I'm sorry. Some people were having. They're going to be online after this. So.
Okay. Yeah, we will be posting all these slideshows afterwards. But I think the whole point in regarding homelessness and what we heard a little bit earlier is there are a lot of reasons for homelessness, and they require services associated with them often, and that the fact that our supply is so tight, vacancy rates in some places at 1 or 2%, that those that are homeless are less likely to find housing. This is a study done by Maine State Housing Authority, but I found it in the report that the Rockland Group did. And it really just talked about the number of renters that were at risk in Knox, Lincoln, and Waldo County. And, when we talk about renters at risk, we're talking about the play between the cost of that housing and what they can afford to pay. And generally speaking, in the field, someone ideally is not paying more than 30% of their income for housing. Sometimes that gets stretched to 40 or 42. What we know out there is people are spending great deal more in housing, and this was something that was identified by the Rockland folks in their study. They did a similar exercise with trying to figure out for the renters what they could afford. And, this is, great discussion now. Those median home prices are 2 years old. They're probably higher. The annual income might be a little bit higher, but they are still struggling, probably more so now than they were before. Our goal is to provide you with data and information over the next few months that will tighten those numbers up a little bit further than the 2020, essentially really beginning to get a better picture of the post-COVID pandemic rates. But the numbers that are trying to find housing is substantial, and it will be difficult to do. The other thing that we obviously are pointing out is the increases in price. This was increases in quarterly sales from 2020 to 2021. We're going to update those numbers. And we're also seeing some of the prices flatten out now. So we're going to try to figure out what the appropriate price is. But for our folks in Lincoln County, the fact that a median sales price is at $347,000, $370,000 is a very high in terms of who can afford those and when they can afford those housing units. And we took a slide from report. One of the wonderful things for any of you that's looking for data information, you can find that data and information on the Maine Housing site. This is what their new first-time home buyer look right now. These are folks that have purchased homes in the last 6 months in Lincoln, Knox, Waldo, and Saginaw County, and it points to the values that the price that they had to pay and what their incomes were, and is a really good demonstration of how Dan's program works, frankly. Then I wanted to just share with you some impressions, some information that we've gathered through different reports that have been put together by a variety of communities. This was pointed out to me by Sally Costello of Brunswick, and it was the Cook's Corner Revitalization Plan. Camoin Associates did a really good market study, and we talked about the fact that Brunswick added more jobs, twice the growth rate of Portland between 2001 and 2020. And there's no reason to think that that's going to slow down, particularly given the redevelopment plans of the base and the emergence of Tech Place and the new companies that are coming out of Tech Place. We anticipate that development occurring that way. Their plan called for incentivizing and integrating workforce housing in the Cook's Corner area, and also talked about their market rate and the pipeline that they thought was expected to meet that regional demand over the next 5 years, but also did talk about low inventory and slow pace of construction. They also noted the demand for single family housing is stronger even than the rental market, which is something that we talked about earlier in this juxtaposition of making sure you provide housing for all markets. And certainly Brunswick is no different than everybody else in the state. Leasing up is happening very, very quickly. Units are often leased up way before their construction is finished. As you know, or some of you, I'm sure are aware, Brunswick passed a moratorium. Sally Costello talked a little bit about that and the concerns that the community had for creating enough affordable housing while they were going through this development expansion. This is certainly with the piece below is just a blog that responded to the newspaper article. It speaks to the conflict that we have right now with trying to keep up with the amount of housing we're trying to produce, make sure that it's meeting the needs by income groups that we need to, and making sure that our ordinance are actually addressing some of those issues. This was a program put together in the Knox, Waldo, Lincoln counties, done by Maine, the Mid-Coast Housing Trust, which is really the Rockland Group. I finally remembered the name with it on the sheet at the screen. Sorry, Jonathan and Joan. And the study was called No Place to Call Home. And their point, and I think they made it earlier in a stakeholders meeting, was that there's some gaping needs at every income level, that companies are finding that they're being turned down. And that's a story that we've heard in all the major employers across all the region, that they're being turned down because people cannot afford the housing that we're providing in the region. Nearly 2/3 of the households in Knox, Lincoln, and Waldo counties don't earn enough pay for a 2-bedroom home. That was the earlier slide that we put up. And renters are simply having trouble staying ahead of things. Again, new housing construction slowed in the last 10 years. Something that Dan and I have talked about, the fact that as we watched it, we knew housing wasn't going to keep up with the demographics that we saw coming. That has played itself out. This is the Bath study that was done in 2021, thanks Deb Keller. And, really, again, you'll see some of the same things, additional new housing, but also addressing the needs of the neighborhoods, potentially the needs of the environment, but also not letting those supersede the need to develop a range of housing types. In Bath, older housing, that is a problem that the rest of our region experiences in different ways in different places, both rural and urban areas. The need for housing improvements, particularly among homeowners, but also in the rental market as well. I think the slide piece that I think really caught me in their report is think regionally. This is a regional discussion. I mentioned at one point the fact that the folks in the Brunswick area are talking about a land bank for creating and saving land for affordable housing. So are the folks up in Camden, Rockland, and how can we work together to amass a funding source that can really allow us to move forward in that topic. And Lincoln County has just launched their housing study. They're out to RFP, but I pulled these comments right off their webpage. I think they really are to the point. Several major factors: coastal issues in the second home retirement. We've heard up and down the coast the issues of second homes, short-term rentals, Airbnbs, and competition for workforce housing. They had an interesting comment about the lack of public infrastructure to support housing, which is something we don't see that often, but we know as planners, is something that we need to recognize and address. And that the county had become the most unaffordable housing community in the state of Maine, and by a lot, by the way, if you saw some of those earlier numbers. And then really just a quick piece to remind us all that there's also a short-term rental competition that's something that is going on here in the mid-coast. I don't think it really addresses the issue of creating housing supply. I think it's a minor part of our housing supply, but it does create competition. It does subtract units out of the flow, and it doesn't necessarily serve not only the folks that need housing in the area, but for the folks that are using that. If we can't afford to find housing for the workers that are providing those services while they're visiting, we've have more than one gap to fill. And that was just simply a graph on the impact of seasonal rentals. Thank you, Max. I'll turn it back to the panel. Our full panel is with us. Jeff Levine, who will speak to LD 2003, Greg Payne from the Governor's Office on Innovation and Futures. I think I'm almost able to say that now. And Dan Brennan from Maine State Housing Authority. And what we're going to do is run through our agenda and then open it up for questions. We'll, if it's anything like our earlier session, it was lively and went right to the limited time. So I'll move forward and hand it over to Dan.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. And it's nice to be with you all today. Good afternoon to everybody on the call and in the room today. I'm Dan Brennan. I'm Director of Maine State Housing Authority. What I thought I'd do today, and you can bring the slides up, Max, is to just run through for you a little bit about who we are at Maine Housing and what we do. For those of you not as familiar with us, it'll help give you a little focus on where we sit within the state and what our mission is, and also what we're not. And then I'll go down through what we do at a very high level, kind of touch on some of the major programs. The issues that Matt spoke about are pretty much what we hear throughout the state. In some cases, it's worse than others, and Lincoln County is obviously very challenged. But this is a focus of ours, and everything that we do is geared towards those particular challenges that Matt was speaking about. So go right ahead and we'll just move along. Who is Maine Housing? We've been around for a little over 50 years. We were created by the legislature. We're a quasi-state agency. Basically what that means is we are not a part of state government. We are we're an independent agency, but we are tied very, very closely to state government. So I report to a board of commissioners and not to the governor, but the governor appoints my board of commissioners. So while we are independently minded, we're a non-political group agency. Our focus is to help people obtain and maintain quality housing and services that they need. We're three things. We're a bank. Think of us as an affordable housing bank. So we are not a developer. We are not a property owner. We're not a property manager, but we're a bank. And if in terms of asset size, we're $2 billion. We would be the fourth or fifth largest bank, Maine-based bank in the state. Go back just a little bit. We're also a program administrator. So over here, we're a bank. And then over here, we administer hundreds of millions of dollars for the federal government, for homeless issues, for rental assistance, for heating assistance, for weatherization. So half our agency is focused on our banking, half our agency is focused on our program administration. And we're also a public housing authority in areas where there's not a public housing authority. So Maine has 25 or so public housing authorities. They are a creature of their municipal government. We don't oversee them. We work in partnership with them, but we can't tell them what to do. And we respect their independence, but we work very closely together to administer a lot of different programs. Matt had touched on this earlier. What is affordable? Basically, if you're paying more than 30% of your income on your housing costs, you're paying too much. And just to put that into perspective, a teacher making $40,000 a year, 30% of that is $12,000, and which is $1,000 a month. Where are you going to find housing for $1,000 a month these days? So that kind of puts into perspective the issue. So we got several tools that we use to create affordable housing. And I'm going to start with multifamily development. So our banking side provides resources to housing developers who want to build apartment buildings or preserve existing apartment buildings. And one of our biggest tools is the low-income housing tax credit. Years and years ago, the federal government used to build affordable housing directly through public housing. And then they switched to a model where they would incent private developers to build housing and provide them deep rental subsidies, 30, 40-year contracts to provide that housing. That ended in the mid-1980s. And since then, we are working with a program that provides a tax incentive for developers to build affordable housing. So basically, we are entrusted with allocating that credit out to development organizations. The developer sells that credit to investors, basically for-profit companies that need to find tax breaks. And the cash that comes into the developer helps lower the amount of money that they need to build the apartment building or renovate the apartment building. And depending on the type of tax credit, I won't get too much into that, but it provides a significant amount of cash to the developer upfront, so that the developer, as a result, can offer their units at lower rents, lower than market-based rents. So that's kind of how the low-income housing tax credit works. It's a national program, and it's the federal government's primary driver for the building of affordable housing. We also have, thanks to our governor's office, thanks to our legislature, thanks to our congressional delegation, received a significant amount of resources in the last several years that have allowed us to branch out from that tax credit program. That tax credit programs can be pretty complicated. You got to hire lawyers, and it's not for the faint of heart. It's a powerful program, but it's complicated. We're trying to come out with more programs that don't utilize the tax credit. We've been able to do that in recent years. So we have a rental housing program focused in on our rural areas. And this is thanks to an investment by Governor Mills through the Maine Jobs and Recovery Act, using the American Rescue Plan dollars that she's flowed to Maine Housing. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to attract developers to acquire or build properties that are between 5 and 18 units, where rents are restricted to 80% of area median income. That's a little bit higher than we can touch with the tax credit program, which is capped out basically at 60%. And everything that we do has an affordability covenant of 45 years. So this is not a case where federal dollars are going to go, or state dollars are going to go into a project, and 5 years from now, the owner is going to flip it to market-based. This is a real protection in place for these. We put this program out several months ago, and at this point, we are fully subscribed for the money that we have. So on one hand, that's a bummer, because we know there are several developers that are currently working on projects. But with this model, we're going to show our governor, our legislator, our congressional delegation that all they need to do is feed money into us so we can get more of them done. The next program that we've been able to put out recently is an initiative to help Maine's unbridged islands. There are 15 unbridged islands that have year-round residents on them. We were effective 10 years ago, almost 15 years ago, in doing a program like this. we have to think, at Maine Housing, we think not just of our major city centers, but also our island communities. These are much smaller projects, 2 to 4 units. But here we're going to go up to 120% of area median income because we know that the economics on our islands are a little bit different. We subsidize these projects up to $200,000, $210,000 per unit. There is money that comes in from the island community. And again, we take a 45-year covenant. So these are, there is still money available. We work very closely with the Genesis Fund on this program. And we're looking forward again to create models for housing development that aren't necessarily a 40 or 60 or 80 unit apartment building, but maybe a 2 unit here or 4 unit here in our island communities. We've also created a program called our short-term real estate acquisition program. And we're focusing in primarily here on our public housing authorities, our community action agencies, and other nonprofit housing developers. In this particular real estate market, it is incredibly important to provide our partners with a financing tool so that when a property comes on the market, they can be a competitive player in that market immediately. So we can provide flexible short-term capital so that this real estate can be quickly grabbed up. They don't necessarily need to tell us what they're doing with it yet, but if they're a public housing authority or community action agency or one of our nonprofit partners, we know what they're going to do with it. But it's important that they get hold of that property right away. So we've been able to put that out there to help our partners become a little bit more competitive. We have a 4% rate. That's as of April 19th, a little bit dated, but that is the rate as of right now. We also have some single family programs. We lend in the single family arena. We provide a first time home buyer mortgage that is very competitive. But one of the things is we don't have enough supply, right? We don't have enough supply of single family homes, starter homes, capes, ranches. The next slide will give you details of the, Max, the next slide will give you details, sorry, of this program. And this is a development capital program. We're trying to attract single family developers, minimum of 5 homes. We're going to provide up to $70,000 per unit in the southern and coastal part of our state and $60,000 elsewhere, so that we can build more modestly priced single family homes. And these are homes that are going to be available for people making 120% of area median income or below, in concert with our first time home buyer program. These maximum home prices of $325,000 and $287,000, these are the federal rates that we use in our first time home buyer program. So we are trying to create a housing supply that is no different than what someone would buy on the private market using our first time home buyer program. Here, we're going to have an affordability covenant of 15 years. We need more single family homes built in our state. As I mentioned before, the other programs that we offer, our first home loan program is our primary program. We have 40 lenders that we partner with around the state. This program right now is taking off like it has. I've never seen it before. Our pipeline of loans that are registered with us by our lenders are over almost $80 million in loans in our pipeline. Usually it's around 40 or 50. That tells us in this area there is a robust market right now. We offer a down payment and closing cost assistance with this of $5,000 to go along with that first home loan program. We hope to do over 1,000 loans this year. We have a mobile home replacement program. There are too many mobile homes in our state right now that are just substandard, and they're not safe, and we need a product there, so we offer that. We created a program in concert with the leadership of Deb Keller at the Bath Housing Authority a few years ago, and working with several public housing authorities and community action agencies, community aging in place. This is all about keeping seniors safe in their homes as they age. getting rid of items in their homes that are going to be trip hazards or things that become too difficult for our seniors to operate, whether it be a knob, opening a door or opening a fridge or operating the stove or getting access to their bathrooms or their closets. Very, very simple home modifications at a very low cost. And we have a home accessibility and repair program working with our community action agencies. We have one of the oldest housing stocks. We have one of the poorest incomes, and our housing stock throughout our whole state is just below standard. And so we have programs to help that. Next slide, we talk about subsidized housing. This is where we administer programs on behalf of the federal government. Housing Choice Voucher Program, otherwise known as Section 8, the current version of Section 8. We administer it on behalf of HUD, as do all of the public housing authorities throughout the state. We administer about a third of the vouchers. The other 2/3 are administered by the local public housing authorities. There are some regional differences between housing authorities based on their size, based on where they're located, but we have really worked hard with the public housing directors to make the program as simple as possible. There's a centralized waiting list now throughout the whole state, so we don't have independent waiting lists among ourselves. And then we have been able to use some of this investment that the governor and the legislature have given us over the years to incent landlords to go ahead and rent to people with Section 8 vouchers. 60% of our vouchers go to people who are homeless. We serve about 4,000 people. There is also the housing that I talked about that was created from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. Maine Housing financed over 7,800 units, over 220 properties currently in our portfolio. These are the ones that have a 40-year housing assistance contract. This is what's called project-based Section 8. These contracts were entered into in the 70s and some in the 1980s, and they're coming due, they're expiring. But thankfully here in Maine, our owners are renewing their contracts. HUD allows them to renew. And we're not losing these critical apartment buildings to market rate housings for the most part. Largely the way they were financed by Maine Housing in the 1970s and 1980s, and the commitment of our housing developers to not lose this critical housing. Next slide. There are a host of projects that were financed by the Rural Development, which is USDA Rural Development. That is not Maine Housing. That is an agency of the federal government. They're based here in Maine. There are thousands of units, several hundred properties. Many of these properties, however, are coming up to a point where they could be lost to the market. And we're partnering with the Genesis Fund on this to provide technical assistance and ownership transfers for many of these are owned by private individuals. We're trying to get these properties in the hands of nonprofits or public housing authorities or CAP agencies, working very hard to do that right now. Our next slide. Maine Housing has been also providing money for supportive housing, people who are sometimes our most vulnerable people in our communities, our mentally disabled, our physically disabled, our homeless populations. We work a lot with nonprofit organizations using, again, money that has been entrusted to us by the legislature through the State Home Fund, one of our most valuable resources. We've been able to do almost 300 properties, over 1,800 units sprinkled all throughout your communities. You drive by them every day, you don't even know that they're supportive housing projects that are providing a huge public benefit. And we're trying to be very active in that area. And then I think finally, this is our last program. We had realized a few years ago that we have been partnering for years with banks and developers, nonprofits, but we haven't been partnering with municipalities. And so a few years ago, we rolled out a program that would incent municipalities to come to us with their idea, what they want to do for affordable housing in their community. This isn't necessarily building a housing project because we have other programs for that. But this is about a municipality who wants to tackle a problem. And Matt and I worked on one when when he was working in Biddeford. And the city of Biddeford wanted to do something about their housing stock, particularly their 2 to 4 unit housing stock that they are losing to out-of-state buyers. And
They did. Actually, that.
hey, Deb Johnson, you need to mute, please.
Actually, what? After the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade.
You just said there's a Johnson coming in.
There we go.
There we go.
I'll get the screen up.
I can vouch for the fact that Deb is a very busy woman doing very important things. So I will vouch for that.
All right, hopefully this is the same slide.
Yes, it is. What this does, so many things that we do at Maine Housing are, we have money, here are the rules, come to us and fit our rules, we'll give you money. This is kind of the opposite of that. This is saying, you have an idea, sell us on the idea, we'll invest in your idea, and then we'll hold you accountable to it. And we've done several of these with different municipalities. That's a piece here, has to be done by a municipality. And this is, I'm hoping, we've done several and I'm hoping to do several more. So I think that might be the end of my presentation. Yes, it is. That's a high-level overview of Maine Housing. I covered a lot of ground, and happy to answer any questions after my colleagues go through their information.
Thank you. I think what we'd like to do now, Greg, is maybe just jump to the governor's office and talk a little bit about your programs and the Housing Partnership Program in particular. And then we'll jump to the LD 2003 and let you both do a bit of a presentation on that and help us think through that. And then we'll open it up to the group for questions.
Sure, that sounds great. Thank you, by the way, for the invitation. My name is Greg Payne. I'm serving as the governor's housing advisor in the Office of Policy Innovation and the Future. I took that job last September. Prior to that, I spent about 15 years building affordable housing at Avesta, based in Portland, and running the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition, doing state and federal housing policy work. I'm just going to kind of walk through some observations and kind of generally how the administration is approaching this crisis at this point, and point out a few things before we move on to the zoning and land use conversation, and then for a conversation, which would be great. I think that, generally speaking, we were dealing with a long simmering housing affordability problem in the state prior to the pandemic. The pandemic in many ways greatly exacerbated that problem. And obviously, house prices and rent prices have gone up considerably since the pandemic hit. I think there's a lot contributing to the rapid rise in both rental costs and housing costs, ownership costs. Certainly one is regulatory land use barriers. There's clearly much too much of our land tied up in single family zoning only. That makes it difficult for folks to create the kind of density we need to add the number of housing units that we need. One of the other issues clearly going on is a lack of labor in our construction sector that's forcing timelines for construction of affordable housing to go up significantly. It's causing projects to not move forward. Clearly, when you have a certain amount of money and you're dividing by a higher number per unit that it costs to build, largely because we don't have enough workers, you can obviously only create fewer units that way. One of the other things that folks are struggling with is supply chain disruptions. I think a kind of good example of the world in the pandemic is that right now, projects all over the place are looking at months-long delays over a component to circuit breakers. There are projects, affordable and otherwise, that are just standing there now and can't proceed to open up and get a certificate of occupancy and let people move in because there's a component to circuit breakers that is out of stock. And this is the world we live in now. I have no sense for exactly how long that's going to take, but it's an example of the way supply chain disruptions are causing problems in the affordable housing sector as well. And certainly another reason that we're having the struggles we are is increased demand. Maine now, I believe, is at the 11th highest level of in-migration from other states. That's a good thing in many ways and in the long term. In the short term, that's creating real challenges with the infrastructure we have. Also, in the greater Portland area, clearly there are hundreds and hundreds of asylum seeker families that are trying to make Maine their home. And that, again, is very, very good news in the long term, I believe, for Maine and our workforce challenges, these young families. But in the short term, the federal government is doing all it can to make sure that they can't work. And it is incredibly frustrating for those families who want desperately to work and employers desperately want to hire them. And unfortunately, for about a year, a little over a year, in most cases, they're not permitted to while they file their asylum claims and go through a 6-month waiting period till they get work authorization. So all of those things kind of combine to make additional challenges these days and have, additional demand and a restricted supply, just logically speaking, leads to this kind of rapidly rising rental rates and home sale prices. In fact, I missed the first couple of slides that folks walk through, but I'm always cognizant of what in both the rental and home ownership sectors, what costs were prior to the pandemic and what they are now. And, the statewide median sales price for a home, for a single family home in Maine in February of 2020, before the world went sideways, was about $217,000. In June of 2022, it is now up to $350,000. That is about a 60% increase since the pandemic hit. On the rental side, it's very, very bad, not quite as crazy, but still crazy, that back in February of 2020, Apartment List is a national research group that does rental work around the country. And they found that the median rent in Maine overall was $855 back in February of 2022. And it is now, as of June 2022, up to $1,190. That is about a 40% increase. So 60% increase on the sales side, 40% increase on the rent side. Obviously, incomes have gone up since the pandemic hit, but not nearly at that kind of pace. And obviously, here we are. The administration's approach, I would call twofold. One is that there is an understanding that we have really highly successful housing production programs, affordable housing production programs, and the governor has invested an unprecedented amount of money in those programs, many of which Dan just talked through. A senior housing bond that she released shortly after taking office, and this new rural rental program that had such great uptake. The home ownership program, there's some new Maine Jobs and Recovery money we'll probably get to announce with Maine Housing later this summer, I would imagine. Those programs are really good. They have a great track record. The reality, though, is that we are in such a hole at this point that we cannot expect that we are going to fill that hole completely with programs like that. There's not enough money in the state budget. There's not enough money in the federal budget. We need to, in addition to investing in those successful programs, also, make sure that there are conditions on the ground that allow the private sector to be more of a help in solving this problem than it can right now. And that does include things like LD 2003, which Jeff will walk through the details of in a little bit. But the overall gist of LD 2003 was to create additional housing opportunities and allow for some modest increases in density that didn't exist before statewide. In addition to that, the governor put $3 million in ongoing funding in the budget to provide incentives to local communities to, in addition to LD 2003 and those rules, add additional ideas that would create housing opportunities locally. And so we'll talk more about that and how that's likely to take off fairly soon. So again, it's both investment in these programs and helping the private sector be able to take a larger role than it has in the past by allowing conditions on the ground to be conducive to their investment. A couple other things I just want to note real quick. One is, we recognize that these programs, especially tax credit programs, but many of the programs at Maine Housing aren't necessarily intuitive. Their housing is complex, financing is complex, and we are talking with Maine Housing about the creation of an additional technical assistance organization that can be helpful to organizations and towns as they confront their housing needs and maybe need help navigating and accessing these programs. That's something that we're working on right now and I think hope to make real in the coming months. Another thing I just wanted to point out is that the commission that was created by the legislature, the Zoning and Land Use Commission, which came up with recommendations to the legislature around zoning rules. It ultimately became LD 2003, that changed significantly by the time it went through that process. But that group is coming back for another round of consultation and meetings in probably September, October, and November, and is then going to give recommendations to the legislature probably in December, and is specifically honing in this time on short-term rentals. And so I know this is something that lots of communities are interested in. I'm not sure there's a great silver bullet. This issue kind of comes up differently in different places. But I just put that out there to the degree folks have ideas about what might be done, what could be done at a state level. Some might say at a state level, let's just leave it to the locals. But to the degree others have ideas too about what that commission might recommend. Dan serves on that commission. My boss, Hannah Pingree, serves on that commission. It's a great time to the degree folks have ideas to please share them with us. We'd love to hear that. That's what this commission is really going to be focusing on. So again, that'll be this fall. And I am going to stop there on that piece and look forward to kind of moving towards conversation.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Greg. Let's continue the discussion and move right to the LD 2003 and walk through that a little bit. And then I think we're ready to open it up.
Great. And there's I think I had a slide that would be helpful. Yeah, if you want to just pull that up. Great. Do you want to kick it off at all, or should I just?
Why don't you do this first, and then maybe after you walk through the details, I'll give a little bit of an update on implementation of
Great.
this.
Great. Okay. So yeah, so I put together this graphic because I think it helps summarize a lot of the pieces of LD 2003 and supplemental budget. I'm Jeff Levine. I'm a planning consultant. I was the planning director in Portland for about 7 years until 2019. And I'm working with the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future on developing some interim guidance for LD 2003 so that communities have the tools they need to get the program launched while the Department of Economic and Community Development gets gears up and gets ready to take on the program. So I think there was a feeling of this is important, let's get going. So I'm kind of bridging for a couple of months while they get their systems up and going. But one of the things that I put together for them was this sort of briefing on what's in LD 2003 and, as Greg mentioned, also in the supplemental budget, because they're kind of interrelated. So this is just a graphic to try to hit the main pieces of what's in the bill and the budget. And I think I'll just go through each of them briefly, and then when there's questions, certainly happy to answer them. There's still some pieces that I think are being worked out. As with all legislation, there's going to be a rulemaking process that will help hone some of the details, but I can give a sort of a big picture view here. First off, in section 3 of LD 2003, it establishes it asks the state to establish statewide and regional housing production goals. So looking at, based on the economy of the state and on the needs of existing residents, and as Greg mentioned, a number of newcomers to the state, what are some housing production goals that the state should try to meet in terms of types of housing, in terms of location, and then how does that translate to regional, ultimately local housing production goals? So that's something that the state will be working on. There's also a municipal role in that, which actually is in section 7, but because it's kind of linked with section 3, I think it's worth bringing up just right after that. That talks about sort of the municipal partnership working on meeting statewide housing goals generally. It mostly talks about issues of fair housing, and then also touches on short-term rentals. Greg had mentioned there's a group, the commission's re-meeting, getting together again this fall to meet about short-term rentals specifically. LD 2003, as one piece, makes it clear that municipalities can regulate short-term rentals. It doesn't say much more than that at this point, but it just makes that clear so that if there's a local interest in doing so, they don't have to, but they can regulate short-term rentals through local ordinance. Section 4, which is a sort of longer blue line right below that, talks about additional housing for densities that are allowed for developments that meet certain affordability requirements. So one of the things that was heard during the commission process from affordable housing developers who work with Dan's office and other and municipalities is so often they come in and they have a great idea for a project. There's probably some support for it, but it doesn't meet the zoning code. And sort of generally, I think the commission tried to get to the bottom of how does that, is there any way to try to systematically address that? And one of the ideas that came out of one of the commissioners was generally, if we could get a higher level of density than a market rate development going into our process, it would provide us with certainty. We wouldn't need to come in for a zoning change. We wouldn't necessarily need to get a contract zone. We could provide this public benefit, and we'd be able to compete for the same piece of land as, say, a market rate developer or some other use. So what Section 4 does is basically says if you have a project that meets certain affordability requirements, a certain number of the units are restricted to be affordable at below certain income levels, you get certain automatic density bonuses. So the sort of constraining factor is it has to basically be in certain parts of the community. It has to be in parts of the community the multifamily dwellings are allowed. And it has to be in areas that are either in designated growth areas under the Growth Management Act or served by public water and sewer. I think there may be one other condition in there, but basically it has to be in certain areas of cities and towns that are really capable of handling these higher densities. And then it has to meet shoreline zoning requirements as well. So it's not just a townwide thing, it's in certain areas. And if you're in those areas and you meet those criteria and the project meets certain affordability requirements, you can get a density bonus. You can do 2.5 times as many units as you would be able to do otherwise. And you also have a cap on how much parking a municipality can require from a project. Those were the two things that the commission heard were really some of the limiting factors in producing some of this affordable housing. So that in a very brief nutshell is Section 4. Moving on to Section 5, which is that smaller blue sort of square there, that talks about what happens with areas that are zoned for single family housing right now. There was a lot of work on the commission about the origins of single family zoning and what perhaps biases it brought in based on not just things like protecting the environment or community character, but perhaps some other concerns that were raised. And to make a long story short, LD 2003 says if you are in a growth area similar to the areas in which you could do affordable housing density, and you have a vacant lot, you are allowed to build up to 4 units on it. A city or town can put certain requirements on that. They can still enforce shoreline zoning. They can ask for, a reasonable review under site plan review. They can have things like dimensional standards like setbacks. They can't have them be different for that 4-unit building as for a single family building, with one exception. They can actually require a larger lot for multiple housing units, what's called lot area per dwelling unit. For those of you who are familiar with that term, that you can have a lot area per dwelling unit, so you can require a larger lot for multiple housing units within limits. So there's sort of a cap put in under LD 2003, and I can go into that in more detail if people want. Similarly, in areas that are not these designated growth areas, there's a minimum of 2 units on a lot. So it's not 4, it's 2. And again, you can require a larger lot for a 2-unit development, but you can't say it needs a larger setback or it has to meet different higher standards other than that lot area size. So the idea being, generally speaking, if you meet certain basic conditions, you can build 2 or 4 units in a city or town based on whether the city or town has identified that area as a growth area or not. The next big piece, which is the green dot on the upper right-hand corner, maybe I should have gone through these in more of a linear order, but I'm going through them by the section numbers, basically says that any single-family home in an area that allows housing in a city or town can put an accessory dwelling unit on. So you can restrict the size of that accessory dwelling unit. You can make it have a maximum size. It can have to meet the same dimensional requirements as any other housing units, basically, but other than that, they're allowed. So a municipality can put certain regulations on can look at well sewer capacity, water capacity, shoreline zoning. But the accessory dwelling units are generally allowed on those lots. I think those are the main pieces. At the bottom, there's this area about the Housing Opportunity Fund that Greg talked about, and that's a chance to give communities technical assistance and financing for implementing housing policy. And that's something that the GOPIF and the state are going to be working out. So that's probably a little bit further out, but those are the main pieces of what's in LD 2003. Did I miss anything?
No,
And this is like Greg said, this is a subset of what the recommendations of the commission were. They had other recommendations as well that didn't end up in the final legislation, but these were some of the key ones. I think with that, I'll hand it back to you. Thanks very much. I appreciate being here.
You want to add?
sure. I can just provide a little update on implementation, what's happening with all this.
Great.
I mean, so as we were talking about, so LD 2003 is separate from the money. So LD 2003 is really about these land use changes that Jeff talked about. And that bill becomes law, I believe, on August 9th. I think that's when that law takes effect. Most of those land use changes, though, towns don't have to enforce locally until July 1st of next year. So that's LD 2003. It comes into effect very soon, but those particular changes, we have about a year for towns to get ready and update zoning laws locally to the degree they want to or need to. Separate from that is the money. And in the FY23 budget that is in effect as of earlier this month, the grants and technical assistance for the local communities, that is available now. I mean, that technically is available now. But what happens is in the state government process, DECD, which is the State Department that's handling all this, they have to get approval within the state system for the 2 new positions that were authorized in the funding. They are doing that now. They're hoping that by next month, they'll have that authorization and then they can go ahead and post and hire for the 2 positions. But what we're trying to do in the meantime is while that happens, and say it's early September when those 2 people start, and this will be their full-time job, is helping communities with implementation of the new law and providing the grants that we hope communities will take advantage of to go above and beyond what LD 2003 does. We wanted in this interim time in the summer to keep the ball rolling. So that's why we asked Jeff Levine to come on board on a contract basis and help us. And the first thing that we are doing now is developing interim guidance for the municipalities, because I think a lot of municipalities have a lot of questions. Zoning is highly technical. Every town has it a little different. And so there's a lot of really valid and interesting questions about how does this apply here or there. We are working on that document now and anticipate we'll be able to publish that next month, with the idea that municipalities can use that as some guidance, which then the next step after we put that out is preparing for the rulemaking that's authorized in LD 2003. There will be formal rulemaking to deal with some of the interpretation issues and specifying some of the details in the law. And so in addition to that, what we'll be starting to do this summer is laying out the building blocks for the grant programs and what those grant programs might look like. What kind of technical assistance do municipalities need? So I would say to that extent, folks should feel free to get in touch with me. I'm certainly happy to hear thoughts that people have. Certainly when we're talking about grants too, we want to make sure that the grant program, which is both kind of for municipalities directly and encouraging regional collaboration, like through councils of governments. But to the extent you have thoughts and ideas about how it would be most effective to receive those grants, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I guess the other thing I want to just reference is there's housing production goals in there. Those are just goals. At this point, there's no mandate that any town reach any of those goals. We don't even know what the goals are yet. But that's one of the things we have to commission is a new statewide research project to better understand the housing inventory we have now and where it's going in the coming years, and identify from there what our housing production goals should be, statewide and then regional. So that we are beginning to put into motion too. And so the idea is that when those new staff come on DCD in, say, September, we will be handing them a baton with a lot of this at least started. And so this isn't sort of a dead period while this important work would otherwise not happen. So I guess the last thing I'd say on this is, the administration is really highly committed to operationalizing all of this effectively. For example, a right to an ADU is, I think, a thing a lot of people are excited about. We really want to make sure that's useful on the ground. There's financing issues, there's functional issues, or, you have the right to do it. How do you do it? Are there businesses that we can recruit that can help make that easy for the average homeowner? We're putting a lot of work and thought into and learning from what California and Oregon have done in this regard, because of the other two states that have kind of created a right to an ADU for most homeowners. So anyway, we are very committed to making it work effectively and not just have a law that maybe doesn't change our housing trajectory, because we feel like it has the potential to be really impactful. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. That was a great broad presentation. I would assume that it has triggered a number of questions out in the audience. I will work with Max, and what I would ask those visitors that are on there, we have a lot of you, so if you would put your hand up so that Max can see the hand come up on the screen, we will go on a first come, first served basis. Anybody in the audience here have a question?
So,
I'm Poppy Arthur, State Representative for District 49. Quick question: how does someone sign up to get the information regarding these meetings for the interim? I mean, are you rulemaking now? Is that what you're saying? Or
Yeah, we're not actually in the rulemaking stage quite yet. I will say DECD is putting up a landing page. It's there right now on their website, and I could probably share it afterwards with Matt so that he can send it to attendees. But there is a button that folks can hit in order to sign up to get information, and another button people can hit to send questions in.
And that will include information once you start the rulemaking?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just really want to thank you for being here today and for being as transparent as possible with everything that's happening. It's really appreciated.
Thank you. And I do have to say too, there's a reason why not many legislatures have passed bills like LD 2003. It's hard. And there's this really tough thing to navigate between local control, which everybody values, and making an impact on what has become a crisis issue for a way of life for Maine people and our future. And the legislature was put in a very hard spot trying to rectify those two, and I think did a really good job. And I know you were one of the people who helped to craft this into something that sees both of those sides and ends with something that can be really impactful in the end without obliterating some sense of local control. These really are meant to meld into local ordinances as much as possible. So thank you for the work that you and the legislature did. I see Representative Dudera is here as well, but did in making this legislation happen.
so I'll just read directly from the Zoom chat from Bob Fournier. Can panelists please speak to the notion that 30A MRSA 4364A doesn't really have any teeth, since municipalities may adopt oversized dimensional requirements per dwelling unit if they want to limit density. Can you talk about the cap?
So
I'm not well versed in that specific. I'm not sure what it's referring to.
do you know, is this
Yeah.
the issue of unit per?
Well, looking to Jeff, help us.
Sure, I think I know what the question is. This has to do with the idea that although you can't have different dimensional requirements in many ways for multifamily and single family under LD 2003, you can require larger lots, that I mentioned in passing. And it sounds like there's a concern that that might just allow communities to essentially not have to meet some of the requirements. So again, I think this is one of those things that was worked out as a compromise. And the way it works is many communities have a basic requirement that says, if you, for your first unit on a lot needs let's say 10,000 square feet of land area. And it varies widely from town to town, but let's say 10,000 square feet. They may then say the second unit, needs 20,000 square feet more. So you'd need 30,000 square feet to build 2 units and so forth. So to build a third unit, you need 10,000 plus 20,000 plus 20,000 or 50,000. What LD 2003 says as sort of a middle ground is you can require larger lots for those multiple units, but you can't have the amount of land for that second unit be bigger than the amount of land required for that first unit. So if you require 10,000 for the first unit, you can only require an additional 10,000 for the second and the third and so forth. You can require a smaller amount for those, but you can't require a larger amount. And this actually came up already with a question with a community outside of this region, where they had a lot area requirement that was some number for the first unit, the same number for the second unit, and then some really big number for the third unit and so forth. And the response was you can have that requirement for the first 2 units, but it has to be the same or less for those third, fourth, and fifth units. So to some extent, it does allow communities to discourage multifamily housing, but it has to apply uniformly to every unit. And if you make it too large for that first unit, you're not going to be allowing anyone to build on those lots, which I have a feeling may not be popular with a lot of the property owners. So it's a compromise. That's how it works. It's designed to make sure that every unit is treated equally. And then beyond that one exception, you can't require larger setbacks or other requirements for those second, third, or fourth units than you would for the first unit. I hope that's somewhat clear.
Yeah, that is. I thought that was great. I guess the one other thing just generally I want to say is I think we also understand we're never going to hone a statewide bill that's going to prevent a town that's desperate to not have housing, do better than that. I think there has to be an understanding in the end with local communities that Maine needs to grow. We need more housing units into our future. And, I think most towns are there. And certainly when we talk about the grants, I think those will be focused on the communities that are going in the direction that, LD 2003 is pushing. But at the same time, I don't think anybody wants a kind of parrying back and forth between local government and state government, where the locals are always trying to find a way out, because the locals will always win that if they want to. I think the spirit of the conversation from the beginning really was, it doesn't need to be like that. We don't need to do radical things. We can work together to make progress. And I hope that's where this goes. Certainly that's been the feel of it to date, is that this isn't a combative thing. It's a let's make progress step by step and do it together.
Batteries on this one died, so I have to come up here. The next question is from Corey. You have mentioned that in your prior meeting that you discussed the need for housing at all levels, which I 100% agree with. Can you describe a little bit how you got to that conclusion? Because I find in many forums like these, that particular point is misunderstood.
I can speak to that a little bit. Obviously, most every forum I attend has to do with affordable housing. And so the subject matter tends to go there, obviously. I think in our discussion we're having prior to, Maine doesn't have enough housing units, period, at most every income level. I won't speak to the multi-millions, but there is a continuum of buying your first home, starter home, Cape Ranch, whatever it may be. Your family grows, you move into your next level house to, give your kids some bedroom space and privacy. And then as then maybe, your career takes a good turn and you're ready to move up and so on and so forth. And I think the recognition was that at most every level in Maine, there is not enough housing stock. What prompted me to go down that road a little bit was a recognition that in some of our programs now with these new non-tax credit programs, I'm beginning to see developers' names that I've never heard before, which gets me very excited. These are individuals that are in the built environment. They've been building homes. Maybe they've been building $500,000 or $1 million homes. And now for some reason, my program has attracted them to build $250,000 homes. I want to meet them. I want to get to know them. I want to know what they're doing. But there is a recognition that throughout most of Maine, we don't have enough housing stock for our population, period. Some of these initiatives in LD 2003, yes, they're going to greatly impact affordable housing, but I think it's going to be positive for housing overall. And I think that's the spirit of what we're talking about.
It's all right.
I have nothing else in the Zoom chat, but Representative Vicky, I see your hand up.
Thank you very much. So much for this forum today. I'm Vicky Dudera. I represent Camden, Islesboro, and Rockport. I also serve on the board of MCOG's Habitat for Humanity, and I'm a realtor. So I am dealing with housing every facet of my many jobs.
Oh,
I think something with Greg was saying, you know, we challenge communities with the not in my backyard idea. I was talking with a constituent this morning who I see is on the call. And, you know, we were just saying that the challenges in Camden and Rockport with 2 pieces of land that we have that could be developed for housing, it just gets so tricky with people coming forward who are neighbors and saying, you know, I've always used this as a park, you name it. And I think we really have to think, especially in those of us who are in small towns with select board types of government, we need to figure that piece out, because everybody will say that we need housing and they'll realize that, you know, the librarian at the library just left the house, the police chief can't take the job, doctors can't take jobs. But we've got to face this not in my backyard problem that we have, and certainly saw it play out in Cape big time. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts on how to start to address that.
Maybe I'll start. I mean, I think the real important part in all that is that the communities themselves need to begin to be proactive about having this conversation at a local and a sub-regional level, and sharing those ideas and identifying the possible risks and conflicts that are there. You know, we are in a housing crisis and communities need to address, you know, Brunswick's act to have a moratorium is because they saw a lot going on and they felt the need to take a break and address that issue, good or bad. They're being proactive about having that discussion and hopefully avoiding the NIMBY issues that might continue to come down the road. You know, it's a good planner's answer.
Yeah, I could just add briefly. I think change is hard. I think people put a lot of their money into their home and people get very attached to the way things are. I think that there's a little bit of a challenge going on, particularly in New England, that loves these traditional New England downtowns. But when you look at community zoning, it doesn't allow that anymore. So what can we do to make sure that the things that we love about our cities and towns are things that we actually can do? And that's, I think, where some of the education needs to come about what is existing zoning going to do to your community, and is it really the direction you want to go in? And maybe the desire to preserve that character can sort of outweigh some of those natural fears and concerns that people have, because I get it. I mean, that's your nest egg, your house usually. That's the way it works in this country. So just a little bit of education, a little bit of planning. But I understand the concerns and the fears people have. I do.
So this is a question specifically for Jeff from Deborah Keller. What is the first thing you would recommend to communities to prepare for LD 2003 taking effect?
Sure, and Greg, feel free to jump in if you wish. I think at this point, the plan from Greg's office is to put out interim guidance in the next few weeks, hopefully within a month. And that should provide some short-term answers as to how to apply LD 2003 and what to prepare for at the local level. There is then an opportunity to change your municipal codes if you wish to align them with LD 2003. The way the law is written, you don't have to necessarily. There is language in there about how it would apply. But I think the best practice would be to look at your zoning and your land use codes and make sure that over time it's aligned with that. But then the other piece is just to start thinking about housing and what it means to your community and what other tools might you be able to use that maybe go beyond, checking the box of meeting a state requirement and thinking about it as a planning issue for your community, which I always think is really important.
Yeah, I do think, in places like Bath that have kind of moved the needle, I think already on some of this, like ADUs, I believe Bath has been pretty strong on. I'm not sure that in the end, the particular sections that Jeff walked through within LD 2003 are that difficult for municipalities to adjust to. I don't think these are huge changes, but I do think that where towns should put a lot of thought, and again, I would love to hear feedback, is thinking about what comes next. Okay, there's these new ordinances and we adjust to those, and again, none of them are radical, but what more could be done? This money that's been put in the budget, we want to put it to good use. So what could towns see doing that go above and beyond LD 2003, do the kind of homegrown solutions that make sense, that people can embrace locally? I think putting a lot of energy into what those would look like and communicating those with us, that's where I think it'd be great if municipalities focused on going forward.
Those two next questions kind of follow this. So.
Yeah. So first one is from Matt. Where can you find examples of towns and their programs which use the Community Solutions Grant Program funds that were discussed earlier? Biddeford was an example that was mentioned.
Sure. We've done.
Let me interrupt. Through your regional council.
Yes. We can provide Matt with the details or summary of them for people to see, but in short, there's 4 that come to mind, and they're all very different, and that's what makes it so neat. And so we did one with Peaks Island. This is before LD 2003 or during LD 2003, but Peaks Island wanted to do an ADU, and they wanted to help do an ADU. So we're like, that's small, that's easy, let's do it. That was simple. The Sanford came to us about land banking, and that was very part of an effort they've been working on for quite some time, and that was a great idea. We bought into that and gave them a grant. The Biddeford one, again, was solely focused on the loss of their infrastructure, these Biddeford, downtown Biddeford, there's a lot of 2 to 4 family homes that people were being displaced, and there was some gentrification going on there, and it was a big concern to the leaders in Biddeford. So we provided a grant. They brought money to the table. That was a much more robust approach. A lot of lead paint in Biddeford as well. So that was a kind of a heavy lift one that we worked on for quite some time. Lewiston, City of Lewiston, the Choice Neighborhood Grant. It's going to be groundbreaking. Well, groundbreaking, that was a bad pun. It's going to be substantial in the city of Lewiston, and they needed to go after millions and millions of dollars, and we helped them with that approach. So each one was unique, and that's what we like it. We also expanded and realized that a community is much more than a municipality, and we have a cultural advisory board where we work with ethnic and community-based organizations around the state that simply we get together once a month and talk about Maine housing and how our programs sometimes aren't accessible as much as they should be to those communities. One of them was our Community Solutions Grant. It said you have to be a municipality. Well, that wasn't the intent. So we just simply changed the eligibility to you have to be a community. And so trying to be as flexible as possible, and those are the 4 that came to mind.
If I could add a little bit on that in terms of our experience, Dan describes it correctly. We did some data analysis. We identified a need in the community. We went to Dan, we said, we have this issue. Our 2 to 4 unit projects are disappearing. We need funding to be able to step in between and try to preserve them and try to preserve affordability. And we got off to a slow start because of the pandemic, but it really began to pick together as we melded it together with our other programs. I guess the message is if you do the work and you got a really sound idea and it's got some backbone to it, go to Dan with the question and his staff will sit down and talk with you.
Next question from you. Is there grant money to allow small towns to hire land planners to help visualize what areas the town could look like over time with new zoning or form-based codes?
It's a hard one.
I mean, I don't know that there's a grant program for that right now. I will say that's exactly the kind of thing that I think the Housing Opportunity Program is meant to create. So again, I suspect it'll be sometime this fall that the grant programs will come out. And, you could have towns or groups of towns applying for grant money for exactly that kind of thing, hiring consultants, hiring planners, working through specific ideas on zoning and land use in a local area.
Thank you, Greg. I think that was really the intent that I understood with the Housing Opportunity Program. So I'm excited about that. I think that is an opportunity for the communities in the region to do some work together.
This isn't a question, but it's sort of a response to that question. My name is Isabel. I'm the planner for Dambroscotta
Nice to
and
meet you.
Harbor. And I just wanted to sort of flag for those on the call that the approach that Dambroscotta and Bay Harbor took with hiring, well, me, but hiring a planner and sharing the cost of that was really interesting to me as a professional and allowed me to, get a salary and benefits, but also work with both communities. And I spent 20 hours a week in both communities. And it was, I've only been there for a month, but so far it's working great.
Thank you. And nice to meet you.
Yeah.
So,
So next is for someone that just says BARF on it. Are the rules being developed pursuant to LD 2003, quote unquote, major substantive?
They are not, they're technical. So,
Gonna save me a trip already.
yeah.
All right. I think next is from Deborah Keller. How do you suggest proactively working to make sure the new ADUs do not become short-term rentals?
Well, I guess this is a hard one. This is one that the legislature considered, I think, making part of LD 2003, but opted not to. I will say again, towns are free to regulate short-term rentals as they choose. So any town can make sure that ADUs built after X date are not, any ADUs are not used as short-term rental housing. But there's not something in the law itself. I think I was on a call with some folks from California about this because they've had so much experience over the years with ADUs and trying to perfect their state laws encouraging ADUs. Their feedback was that generally the majority of units were not used for short-term rental or most of them were put into long-term rental stock. And so they naturally did not get used predominantly for short-term rentals. That's their experience. They've kind of let the market figure that out. I totally understand the concern, but I think at this point, if there's going to be regulation of those ADUs, it's going to happen from the local level, unless, of course, we see in the coming legislative session, if there's some broad-based bipartisan ideas based on what the commission discusses in the Zoning and Land Use Commission on short-term rentals coming up. If that reaches some consensus, that may be the next opportunity to affect that issue.
and I guess the thing that we'll do as the regional council is our intent to develop a technical assistance program and deliver that in the region. Max and I have both been fielding conversations about the short-term rental and ordinances that are appropriate for that. So we can conduct a training session and invite everybody, just the way we have today, to come to that training session and disseminate that information in an effective, efficient way, and then help the communities go through that process. So.
That's good going. Next question from Representative Ali Dagger. Any grants available to homeowners to build ADUs used for long-term rental housing?
Not currently, but it is something that my staff and I are exploring. That would be a little new for us, but something that I would embrace if it can be done in such a way that will be consistent with our mission and also being able to secure it as long-term rental. I'm very curious about it. So we're exploring and looking into possibilities there.
Are you thinking of that as a grant or a mortgage?
Haven't got that far yet.
Okay.
We'd have to think that through, but clearly as a housing finance agency, this would be something that should be posed to us and we should explore it and look at it, and we are.
I'm having fun watching Max test his eyesight today.
I know during the 3 to 4 hour session, people just raised their hands and they said it. Everyone's just throwing it in the chat. I don't know if this is just because of me or not. This is from Barb again, specifically from John Del Vecchio. Do the lot size and other dimensional provisions for affordable housing included in LD 2003 apply to areas regardless whether or not they are served by public sewer?
So the short answer is they don't apply everywhere in a town. They apply in areas that are designated growth areas under a comprehensive plan and or are served by public water and sewer. So they would only apply in certain parts of the community. They would also have to be areas where multifamily housing is allowed.
And this one is from Deborah Keller. This is going back to Representative Geiger's question. Is Maine Housing considering a loan program to assist homeowners in creating ADUs?
Same answer. Yes, we are considering, exploring it, looking at it, and haven't got past that stage yet. But
I don't believe there's any questions right now. I don't see any hands raised or anything in the chat. Well, I'm hearing some notification going off here.
Well, let's close off the questions and let's come back down the table and just do a quick summary statement. And we'll call it an evening. And you guys can enjoy the traffic. Go ahead and on the way back.
Yeah. Well, again, I appreciate the invitation. We don't have that many opportunities to have regional conversations like this. I appreciate, Mid-Coast Council of Governments putting this together. I would say again, none of us feel like we have all the answers on this, and it's incredibly complicated. And some of the solutions are frankly global issues that we can't completely move the needle on, certainly. But I hope that people will proactively reach out with thoughts and ideas. My office, the Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, is meant to be one that people feel comfortable reaching out to with their ideas. And I think as housing increasingly becomes a crisis level issue for Maine and our future and what we're going to be as a state, I just encourage folks to reach out and share their thoughts and ideas, what's happening that you think makes sense, what maybe isn't making sense, but also your new ideas. We'd love to hear them. And thanks again for inviting us.
Great. I would also like to thank you for inviting us. I love getting out into the field. I don't do it as much as I used to when I worked as a city planner. So it's nice to talk to folks directly and hear their questions. I think the one thing that I would add is that this is actually a really exciting moment, in my opinion, for Maine. I think Maine is in the top sort of 5 states in terms of actually thinking about the housing challenge we read about in the newspapers every day, but actually trying to do something about it. California, Oregon, to some extent, Massachusetts, but Maine is really trying to run with this because I think Maine sees it as an economic issue, as a quality of life issue, as a aging in place issue, and is trying to be proactive about it. I think that's really exciting because I see a lot of states that really aren't doing much about this issue, and I think in the long run that will hurt them. So it's a great time to be in Maine.
yeah, I'd echo. Thank you, Matt, for this is what Matt Eddy 4.0 or 5.0 from my perspective. This is about the 4th or 5th time we've worked together in different areas, and I love it. I get asked a lot, I do a lot of media and I get asked a lot about how overwhelming the problem is and how tough things are. We've got homelessness, we've got pandemic, we've got affordability issues, and that's all true, right? That is absolutely true. But what I often say is, look at all that we're doing. In the 30 years I've been at Maine Housing, this is absolutely an unprecedented time, and the excitement and the energy is palpable in my organization and everything that we're doing. So yeah, it's a real tough time out there, but we're also creating and developing and doing so much. So we are actually attacking this as it's happening. And we're dwelling on the positive future of all the investment that we have made. When this pandemic calms down and hopefully the economy calms down, I think that leaders are going to understand the importance of housing in a way that they didn't beforehand. And my hope is that we're going to continue to get this investment. $100 million a year for 10 years is what we need, in my opinion, to get this, to get ahead of this. And anyway, that's sort of where my thoughts are at. And I really appreciate being asked to come out and speak to you, and be happy to come back anytime.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate you coming out here. For those that are at home, the one thing that they're not really talking about, it's about 85 degrees in this town hall today. So it's a little warm. Council governments is a resource. This meeting is about that. You'll be seeing a summary report that comes out with this. We'll be approaching our board of directors, and we'll be reaching out to you again to really talk about some strategic plan issues around the housing issue this fall. In the short term, we will put together some technical assistance work. We'll watch for the information coming from the GOPIF office and Jeff as you move through that material. And we will be providing that as quickly as we can and as we understand it as well. So we look forward to working with all the communities, and we thank the folks that have come out here and sat in the room. And we look forward to talking about this issue quite a bit in the next 6 months to a year. Thank you.